Living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast, connecting Virginians to their government. We're pleased to have Delegate Jeffrey Bourne with us this morning from Phoenix. Welcome, sir.
Well, welcome. Thank you, Woody, for having me on the show. It's great to be here.
You represent the 71st District, I believe.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit about your district makeup, the diversity, demographics, economics.
Sure. So it really is a microcosm of the city and the region. Generally speaking, it's the Fan neighborhood, Jackson Ward, Carver, Bellevue, Ginter Park, Highland Park, Battery Park, Churchill, downtown, sort of that northeast quadrant of the city. So you've got some fairly wealthy people, but you also, when you look at the housing projects that are in the 71st District, you've got some pretty severe poverty too, and everything in between.
So who are the major employers in the city?
Well, I think in the city it's probably the government. So you have both local government, state government that are in the city. You have companies that are headquartered here like Dominion, West Rock, the banks, the law firms, the list goes on and on. So we've got a pretty diverse economic district. We've got a lot of the major office buildings and sort of downtown business district. And then we've got some great neighborhoods.
Do you have many constituents who work in Washington, D.C.?
You know, I don't know what the number of folks who work in Washington, D.C. is in the 71st District.
It's kind of interesting because there are people who traverse Interstate 95
Yes.
and complain a lot about the new tolls, so I was
Yes.
just interested in that. But be that as it may, I take it then that the city of Richmond and surrounding areas aren't as dependent upon the largesse of the federal government, if you will, as Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads, for example.
Well, I think we are, because I think Virginia is so heavily dependent upon and relies upon the federal government. When you look at all the military installations, when you look at all the defense contractors, especially in Northern Virginia, as you mentioned, Virginia does benefit greatly and is a great partner for the federal government. We love to have those jobs, those people live within our borders. So we do have some in the larger region, especially when you look at Fort Lee down that way. So, yeah.
Tell us a little bit about where you grew up, what your background is in terms of education and training.
Sure. So I was born in Connecticut but raised in Wytheville, Virginia. That's where my dad grew up. So I went to public schools all the way through my schooling. Went to George Wythe High School in Wytheville, go Maroons. After graduation, I went to William & Mary. Studied economics, played a little football there, and then really got the sort of public policy, political bug between my junior and senior year. I went up to Washington and served as a Congressional Black Caucus intern for a woman named Sheila Jackson Lee, who represents Houston in Congress. And after graduation from undergrad, I knew exactly what it is I wanted to do. I wanted to be in this world, whether it be on the staff side. I hadn't really contemplated elected office. So I tried to get back to Washington. Ultimately hooked up with the Sierra Club, doing some energy policy stuff for them, and then got a wonderful opportunity to serve as Deputy Policy Director for Mark Warner when he was running for governor. So I did that, and he was successful, moved to Richmond in 2001, served as one of his senior policy advisors in his administration, then went back to law school, and practiced law in the private sector for a little bit, returned to public service. And then for the last 3 years before getting elected, I served as Deputy Attorney General for Mark Herring, doing transportation, real estate, and construction litigation.
What was your experience as a member of the school board like?
It was both the most rewarding and challenging thing other than parenting, having kids. You know, it is it's so rewarding to see changes that you're a part of, and positive changes for what I think is the most important thing we can do as policymakers, we can do as a community and a society, which is really start to build the type of education system that our children deserve and our families and communities expect. But, you know, it's challenging because you're dealing with everyone's most precious resource, their children. And so when a bus is late, when a teacher's not, in a parent's estimation, living up to what they believe is a good teacher, then you're going to hear about it. You're going to hear about it at church, you're going to hear about it at the grocery store, you're going to hear about it on the playground when you're out there with your kids. So that's why I say it's the most challenging but yet rewarding thing that I've done outside of trying to raise my own 2 children.
How's the school system in Richmond doing now, especially K through 8?
Well, I think certainly no one who understands the school system would suggest that the system is where it needs to be or where anybody involved in it would want it to be. I think we are doing things differently and better in Richmond than we have in the past. I think there's a renewed sense of hope and optimism. There's a renewed level of engagement with both the families and larger community about making sure that RPS does succeed and succeed in new and innovative ways. So I think the outlook is good for Richmond Public Schools.
How important is the relationship with the state and especially the Department of Education?
Sure. Well, you know, obviously you want to have a great relationship with the state because, one, they set a lot of the policy through the Board of Education. We provide a lot of funding for local school divisions. But for a place like Richmond, which is at the seat of state government, you know, it's critically important. I mean, the superintendent of Richmond Public Schools can literally walk across the street and down the hill and meet with the state counterparts, really, you know, sort of noodle over innovative ideas that they might want, any sort of issues that the state is having from an oversight perspective. You know, it would be incumbent upon the city of Richmond and any locality that's really close to Richmond to really forge a strong relationship with the state education professionals.
Now I understand there's a new head of the Department of Education. Who is that?
In the city or?
No, the state.
The state, yes. So Dr. Staples retired towards the end of last year. The name of the interim superintendent escapes me right now, but I expect, you know, in the next couple of months that the governor would announce his permanent pick.
How important, from your perspective, is pre-K education?
You know, we talk a lot about what issues are important to make a good education system. And from where I sit, from where I've experienced, pre-K is one of those issues that if it's not the top issue, it's going to be in the top 3. Because when you look at kids coming to kindergarten ready, so when you say ready, knowing your numbers, your colors, being able to write your name, all those sort of basic skills that everything else is built upon, we still have too many 3- and 4-year-olds in Virginia that aren't getting quality pre-K. And when you look at those who have had pre-K and those who haven't, the differences and the gaps are stark. And so what we want to do, what I want to do, and what I believe we should do is really make it even more available to every single 3- or 4-year-old in the Commonwealth of Virginia to have a slot for pre-K. Because if you're not ready for kindergarten, by the time you get to 3rd grade and we start the SOLs, we really, you know, really start to accelerate the learning. The kids are even further behind, and it's harder to catch up when you're there.
What about focusing on the kinds of trauma that young kids suffer both physically and mentally in some of our homes?
Well, you know, Woody, that's a great question, and you know, obviously my experience is informed by what goes on in Richmond, and you know, a lot of the kids in Richmond that come to school bring more in their backpacks than just the books and their lunch. They have a lot of baggage. They've experienced a lot of trauma, whether, as you referenced, either physical, emotional, social, just environmental trauma. And so when you look at how that trauma manifests itself. Oftentimes it might be a behavior issue for a week or a day. And what we've got to do is make sure our teachers, bus drivers, anybody that comes in contact with these students is at least on some level trained to recognize that it's trauma manifesting itself, and then how to deal with that and provide the resources that we need to help that kid stay healthy, to help that kid really deal with the trauma and overcome some pretty seemingly insurmountable odds.
Do you think there are enough resources devoted to that now?
No. You know, I think a lot of the education professionals, I think this is not a partisan issue. I think you will find both Democrats and Republicans, rural, urban, really say we don't fund, there's not enough resources put into things like this. I'm doing all I can. I know a lot of my colleagues are. I've submitted budget amendments that would provide these types of supports for our school divisions. I've signed on to other funding supports for at-risk children. So, I mean, it's really a concerted effort to really address, excuse me, and help the students who need our help the most.
It's very important. Pay me now or pay me a whole lot later,
Yes.
Given the consequences. And as we know, one of the predictors of success and failure occurs at the third grade level.
Yes.
If kids aren't reading at that point in time, you can almost guarantee they're going to wind up in the correctional
That's right.
institution.
That's right.
You have a bill. As a matter of fact, I believe there was a press conference
Yes.
last week dealing with the school to prison pipeline. Talk to us about what's going on there.
So I think you just hit on it when we look at third grade and how we can sort of extrapolate and figure out success or failure or something in between by third grade reading scores and third grade performance. But what also happens is we have right now in Virginia, a school division can long-term suspend a student for 364 days.
That seems to be counterproductive.
It does seem counterproductive because if a kid obviously is not in school, they're not learning. And oftentimes, you know, they're not in a safe, structured environment where they can continue to grow. We've seen over the last several years some decline in suspensions, but over the last couple of school years, the most recent data we have is 2015, 2016, it's starting to creep back up. But when you unpack those numbers, you really begin to see the huge disparity in use of suspensions between and among African American and minority students and disabled students. They are 3, 4, 5 times more likely. I think the stat is a learning disabled African American student is about 20 times more likely to be suspended. And so, you know, there certainly, I don't want to suggest that students shouldn't learn consequences. There shouldn't be consequences for very serious violations. But I think we as policymakers, our teachers, our principals, are much more creative, much more innovative, that we can come up with other ways to make sure they learn the consequences, but also meet our most basic moral responsibility, which is to educate the children. And so when you think about 45 school days, that's a whole marking period, nine weeks.
That would be the cap under
That would be
your
the cap under
legislation.
my bill. And I'm claiming it, and I'm an eternal optimist. So I know we've got a long way to go, but I feel good about where we are, and I think this will be a policy shift that will yield the beneficial results that we want.
So basically, things that I would have gone to the principal's office for years ago, kids are being suspended for.
Sure, and you know, there are many horror stories where a kid is getting suspended for 2 weeks, 3 weeks for kicking a trash can. You know, we're seeing school divisions long-term suspend students for assaulting a teacher, and having been on the school board and heard these types of cases, sometimes the assault of a teacher is if you've got two kids in a fight, they're trying to get away from each other, they might inadvertently swing their arm and hit a teacher. It's not, they weren't trying to punch the teacher in that instance right there, but you know, that's what's coming before the school board, that's what's happening. Now, I will say there are circumstances where, and the assault is real and the intent was there and you can tell. And
Criminal behavior.
Criminal behavior. And so when you think about if somebody's doing something to get long-term suspended or expelled, the likelihood that there's also an accompanying criminal charge for something very serious, bringing a gun to school, possessing drugs with the intent to distribute, all those sort of horrible things that we wouldn't nobody would tolerate. I think those we can deal with those.
Now, as I understand it, part of the problem relates to the fact that at least at the kindergarten through third grade levels, there weren't many resources or alternatives to suspension.
Correct. A lot of school divisions have alternatives for middle school and high school.
Right.
But for the elementary school kids, they don't have those types of resources and alternatives. And I think this is another one of those issues. We talked about the bipartisan nature of school discipline. I carried the House Bill 1600. Somebody who I've grown to respect and admire, Dickie Bell, on the Republican side is carrying a bill which would prohibit any suspension for pre-K to third grade, which when you look at the research, when you think about how a young child's mind is still being formed, their ability to understand consequences, that's a policy that I think is a no-brainer.
What about your high schools, especially in terms of more innovation, dual enrollment with community colleges? Are those things being done?
Yes. So that's another. I mean, education for 9 times out of 10 is going to be a bipartisan issue, and dual enrollment, making sure that our kids are prepared to either go in the workforce or go into college, is another one of those issues. And so you see a more assertive, a more aggressive approach to allowing dual enrollment. And so, right now there are school divisions around the Commonwealth, here in Richmond, Henrico, other places that you can dual enroll junior, senior year, and when you come out, you've got an associate's degree. So not only are you advancing yourself academically, but you're helping mom and dad out with their pocketbook, because now they've only got to pay for 2 years of college if you choose to go on and get a bachelor's degree. I think what's even more important is, with our community colleges, we now are those students who graduate with an associate's are just about guaranteed, admission into a state college and university. And so I would submit that Virginia has the best public college system in the country, and so that it really is an important issue that we're going to keep advancing and keep figuring out how we expand, not contract.
It's also a major tool to develop a workforce,
yes,
and that helps to retain businesses and attract new ones.
Exactly. I mean, you look at what questions a business might ask if they're either considering expansion or locating here. It's, tell me about your schools, tell me about how safe the community is, and then tell me about the workforce. And so if we continue to develop the pipeline of professionals that these companies will need and want, then I think Richmond and the region is going to continue to be an attractive place for the type of investment and location and expansion of businesses that we want.
One of the issues that I'm sure you wrestled with on the school board and are continuing to address here are the standards of learning.
Yes.
And the complaints we've heard over the years. Obviously a standard is needed, but there were a lot of complaints about too many tests, teaching to the test. How's that all working out now?
So I think it's probably taken us a little longer than I would have liked to get to where we are, but we now have a momentum and a belief that the standards of learning as they are currently constituted aren't necessarily the best assessment tool, because one, they're minimum standards. Two, what's happening is students are only being tested on rote memorization, and so they're really not giving us a clear picture or a true picture of how well or not a student is doing and how well or not a school is doing. I think they've become a hammer for people to say this is not a good school or this is not a good school system, when in fact there's so much more that goes into the quality of a school, because you could have a school that doesn't meet the standards,
sure,
but they're offering band, they're offering orchestra, they have a thriving foreign language, they've got a great STEM program, all these other things that are preparing children for success, but they don't meet a minimum standard, right? So I think that's an overarching piece. I think one of the things that we're seeing now is really rewarding progress for the schools and school systems that haven't progressed or met the standard, because if you've got 20% of the kids passing the test, well, it's a good thing if next year 30% of them, and then the year after that maybe 37% of them. You know, so we want to reward and measure progress, because that's how we'll know if we're doing the right thing and making the right changes to how we administer public education.
What about teachers? Is there a lot of pressure on them based upon these standards?
Yes, I think, you know, there is a lot of pressure, and which is why you hear anecdotally that teachers are teaching to the test, because there's pressure to make sure all their kids pass the test, or at least 70% of them. And so, you know, I can't imagine what it's like to stand in front of a classroom with that pressure. If we would take that pressure off of them, I bet we would see more success and better results, because teachers would be free to do what it is they've been trained to do, which is make sure that kids are meeting certain benchmarks, they're learning, they're developing those critical thinking skills, those analytical skills that they're going to need throughout their life. And so, you know, I hope that we continue. We've reduced the number of tests over the last several years, so we need to continue to do that. We're going through a high school redesign, so what it looks like, what our high school looks like. And so, you know, these are all things that we've got to do, because education is not the same as when I was in high school or middle school. And so we've just got to continue to be flexible and make the changes that need to be made.
You mentioned STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. They are very, very important. There has been a stigma, however, over the last 30 years or so on the trades.
Yes.
You mentioned kids who can get an associate's degree through dual enrollment. There are certificate courses
Yes.
at our community colleges, welding, plumbing, electrical work, cybersecurity.
Yes.
Talk to us about the importance of the community colleges in your district.
Well, you know, community colleges play such a vital role, not only for, you know, the traditional K-12 student, but also the lifelong learner that wants to continue to develop their skills, get additional training. So we've got to continue to fight that stigma that if you're not going to college, if you don't have a college degree, that you're just not somehow successful. Because, you know, like you mentioned, all those industries, you know, are very technical, you know, and we have a shortage of trained workers, and the community college system can be the vessel that really does train up the workforce in ways that industry wants, industry needs. Because when you think about how we do manufacturing now, how we're welding, how we're building houses, all these industries, it's not, you know, it's not simply a nail and a hammer. You know, you've got to understand math and angles and, you know, engineering and all those sorts of things. So our community colleges are a great place, and we got to continue to support them so that they can provide the services to more people.
Sometimes it's hard for us in America to take lessons from our friends in Europe. For years, they have had a real partnership with industry in
Yes.
terms of apprenticeships, and that's what we're really kind of talking about.
You know, that is absolutely true, and that's why I've introduced a bill that would, it's a pilot project, it's very small, together with Senator Sturdivant, who I've served on the school board with. We want to create a tax credit program for companies in and around Richmond or wherever that would hire 25 kids out of Richmond Public Schools for 2 years. They would get a dollar for dollar tax credit for what they paid the student, because so it incentivizes businesses, and it gives kids a little bit of money in their pocket. But most importantly, beside the money, it really helps them develop the skills and the tools that they're likely learning at a technical center, doing their career in tech ed. And so we want to see if it works, because if it works in Richmond, then I think it's something that we could take to scale. And it would really, I think, would target small, medium-sized businesses with the tax credit.
And of course, not to diminish education at one of our institutions of higher learning. We've got some flagship institutions. We've got VCU, we've got the University of Virginia, we've got historically black universities and colleges in the Commonwealth. And we should definitely encourage those who want to continue their education there, but there's a cost.
Yes.
It's significantly higher, and it keeps going up and up. How do we deal with that?
So, I think we've got to continue to find ways to invest in our public colleges and universities, because, if the state's not investing in them, then they've got to get their operating capital from somewhere. And unfortunately, we've seen increases in tuition, and then you try to balance that with because we've got such great colleges and universities, lots of people want to go there. And so sometimes you'll hear a lot of families say, I'm a Virginia resident and I can't get my kid into James Madison or William & Mary or ODU or UVA. And so there's this push and pull. And so I'm beginning to learn more and more about the higher ed issues. My focus has always been K-12.
Sure.
But I mean, I know we've got to do more to support all of our state colleges and universities, including and specifically, I think, the historically black colleges and universities, because the reason they were founded and a big part of why they continue to operate and play such a critical role today is they really are, beacons of light for a lot of our students. And my wife went to a historically black college and university, and while we were dating in college, there were a lot of times where I'm like, she is getting something that I'm not getting. And it's, sometimes it's academic, but a lot of times it's not.
Right. Lots of changes since you were first elected last year, 15 new Democratic members,
Yes.
and of course you predicted that.
I did, yeah, right, yeah. If you believe that, I've got some oceanfront property in Jackson Ward, I'll sell you.
What has that meant to the House of Delegates, in your opinion?
So I think it means, and it has meant for the first month, that there's a greater appreciation for bipartisanship. There's a greater appreciation for getting some issues that might have been not as high on the priority list, higher on the priority list. I think there's a real opportunity for us, all 100 of us, whether you're Republican or Democrat, to really do what I believe each of us were sent here to do, which is find, common sense solutions to problems that and challenges that people face. So when you think about what is it that people really care about? Well, they want good schools, they want roads that are safe, they want our neighborhoods to be safe, they want to be able to have jobs and economic opportunity no matter where you live. And those are issues that I think all of us can agree on are important. Now, we may disagree on how we get there, but if we can sort of focus on those issues where there is at least a base level of agreement and leave sort of the divisive issues alone, I think our Commonwealth will be better for it, and our constituents will be much happier if we can find a way to do that.
We've got about 30 seconds
Okay.
left, but there have been other changes in terms of transparency.
Yes. No, I mean, and that's one of the great things. I mean, we're live streaming our subcommittees, committee meetings. We've got recorded subcommittee votes. So people as far away as where I grew up in Whitfield can now watch us do our work. And so that injects a level of transparency that I think is needed and makes the process better.
Great. Thank you for your time, Delegate Jeffrey Bourne, 71st District.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast. Until next time, I am Woody Evans.
Mm-hmm.